Hello and welcome back to General Science. We are in our final two episodes and we're going to be finishing up with some more environmental science. Today we're going to be talking about the tragedy of the commons, which is actually originally an economic term but has since grown into something that environmental scientists and biologists also use to explain certain ways that humans interact with the environment. So let's get started. We're going to talk about first kind of a definition of a commons. Like, what is a commons, right? We're talking about this tragedy. We need to know what the tragedy is about. Well, a commons is just like a public space used by everyone in an area. So like you could think of it more like as a library or a public park. That's a commons, right? It's something that the community has designated for everybody to use. But in this video, we're going to be referring it to more of an environmental sort of thing. So we could think of it as like a national park or water or clean air. In the original example that is given, English grazing lands are the commons. So that's the example we're going to stick with in our video. But that's what the tragedy of the commons is going to be about, is something going wrong with these common shared spaces. So what then is the tragedy of the commons? Well, the tragedy of the commons is the idea that these public or shared resources like grazing land or clean air or water, when given this to a community, the community members are going to make decisions that benefit them individually and not do what's best for the common good. And so they're going to act in their self-interest, and because of that, the resource will be depleted or destroyed and become unusable for everyone. And this is obviously a great model to talk about environmental destruction, right? We've got clean air. People have the ability to use it however they want, but people are going to make decisions that are going to impact how clean that air is, right? We have a limited amount of water that we can use to drink. How are individuals going to act? That might end up subverting that common goal of having clean drinking water for everybody. So the tragedy of the commons, although originally something purely a study of economics, becomes this big kind of psychology about how we use environmental resources as well. So where did this idea originate? Like I said, it was first conceived by an economist. His name is William Forster Lloyd, and that was all the way back in 1833. See, back then in England, not everything, all the land was privatized. So there were some areas that were private that individual farmers or ranchers or whatever would use for their own animals and growing of crops. But there were also common areas. And so those commons, as they are called, were for everybody in the area to use, and it was for animal grazing. So like if you had sheep or cows or whatever, you could send them to that common pasture, and that's where they could do their grazing, so you didn't have to use your own land for that. Garrett Hardin, who's an ecologist, was the first person who actually took that idea and used it in the scope of ecology and environmental science, and that was in 1968. So that was about 130 years later when scientists were like, oh, this really describes a lot of stuff that we're dealing with, and they kind of took this idea and ran with it. And so now, since then, scientists have spent a lot of time and resources studying the issue and figuring out what's the best way to get rid of the tragedy in important environmental commons. So we're going to use the original example for of the common grazing ground to kind of go over as an example of how this works, and then show potentially some solutions to the issue. So if you can close your eyes and imagine for yourself for a second, right, this wide open English countryside, and you know, if you've ever seen like an aerial picture of the English countryside, there are like hedges that like enclose square plots of farmland or whatever, right? Well, imagine one of them maybe a little bit bigger than the others in the area, and that's going to be the common grazing ground. So all the farmers in the area can take their sheep or whatever and have them graze in that larger area. Now, let's say there's no rules as to how the farmers can do this. They can just send their animals over there however and whenever they want. Well, if that happens, right, the farmers are going to eat the grazing grounds dry. It's not going to be useful anymore, and their sheep aren't going to have enough to eat, right? Because everybody's using it whatever they want, and there's no regulation of this grazing ground. So to prevent this kind of tragedy, scientists have kind of worked with policymakers and other things, and they've realized that there are ways to prevent the exhaustion of resources. And if you think about how humans have used resources like maybe like coal or oil or stuff like that, for a long time we were using it without any regulation. It was like, yeah, we need more coal, let's just go get more coal and burn it. And now we're realizing, okay, that's not great. We can't do that anymore. So in some cases, the government can step in and regulate the commons to ensure that there's some careful management. And you can see that in some countries, right? They'll say, okay, we can only log so much of this forest, and then every time you cut down a tree, you have to plant 2 more trees, right? That's government management. And then sometimes commons get privatized, meaning they end up breaking it up into smaller pieces, and then each individual gets a choice of how to use that. So you could think of that as saying, like, okay, the government owned this big swath of land. They no longer need it. We're going to sell it to individuals to turn into businesses or whatever, right? That would be an instance of that happening. So let's take a look and see how that would affect things. So, for instance, one way to regulate is what's called top-down regulation, which is where the government says, okay, here are these rules that you have to follow. If you don't follow them, you're in trouble. Okay, so for instance, they might say, okay, we're going to divide the commons up into sections, and your animals can only feed in one section for a couple months, and that way we don't deplete the resource, right? It gives it time to regrow. So that's one way of doing it. And that's been shown to be effective in some ways. Another way, like I said, was privatizing it. So you take your big, huge common land and you rip the hedges out and you re-hedge it so that it's all owned by different farmers. Well, in that way, each farmer gets a little bit of that land, and then they can use it however they wish. And so if they burn through it, that's on them, and it's not affecting the group as a whole. So it becomes a private issue, which can work, but it's also not the best, because now this common good is gone. We can't use that thing, right? It would be like the United States saying, okay, all water is officially property of the United States, and we get to decide how, and then we're going to give each of you your section of water, and that's it. So if you use it all, sorry, you're done. That wouldn't work out pretty great. Some people are going to burn through that water a lot faster than others. It's just not going to be a great system, right? Now, what we've learned recently, and actually there's a Nobel Prize about this in economics, is that community cooperation can actually solve this issue without the need of governments or privatization. So in this instant, each farmer would work together to utilize the field. They come up with some sort of social norms or mores to work the field in their own way to make it so that it doesn't get used up. And there's some evidence that shows that this actually does work in some instances. Obviously, it's not going to work for everything, but it is an option that has become more accepted in the community after we've seen some evidence showing that it does actually work. We can get people to not act in their self-interest if we put in some groundwork, which is awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about implications for the environment before we end our little video here. The destruction of common resources can have a huge impact on the environment, right? We've talked about some of those resources: water, clean air, being able to see the stars in the sky, our energy resources, farmland, all this kind of stuff, are commons that we all rely on, and that can be easily destroyed by individual actions, or even not just an individual's actions, or maybe like a corporation's actions, or right, an individual actor. And so in countries like the United States, there have been environmental laws and regulations that have been put into place based off this lesson of the tragedy of the commons, right? People are not going to act in their self-interest, and so we need to regulate these things to make sure that they don't destroy them, because we need them, right? We need to have clean air to breathe. We need to have clean water to drink. We're going to ensure that using some top-down regulation. And then other countries have gone the other way, where they've privatized things. So, for instance, currently in some countries, right, they're like, well, people are chopping down our forests. Well, we're still going to sell it off. We're still going to make it privatized. We need the money. And so they'll sell it off, and then it becomes individuals' issues that the forest is going away. Not great for the whole, like the world, but in that certain country's instance, that was the best solution for them. So, right, the tragedy of the commons is something that we still are dealing with today. And the commons in this case is the planet. Right, in the last episode, we talked about climate change and how our planet, really, we could say, is a commons, and we have to make some decisions on how it is we're going to save that commons from being run down. Is it going to have to be top-down regulation, where we force countries to stop using carbon? Is it going to be up to private actors, like we've been kind of doing so far? Or do we have to instill a sense of community cooperation and make the biggest polluters stop polluting? We haven't come up with that solution yet. And environmental activists and scientists are kind of pulling their hair out because of it, because the world can't seem to get their act together. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this second to last, penultimate episode of General Science. We're looking forward to finishing out the series with you next time when we talk about climate change a little bit more, and then we'll be out of here. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for our final episode.